The chains around her wrists hummed with energy that would kill her if she moved too fast. But Commander Alara Vance had stopped caring about the threat hours ago when they dragged her from her salvage ship and threw her into the holding cell with the others. She had been running cargo through the outer rim, staying away from the major trade routes where the big corporations and their alien allies liked to play their power games. And she had thought she was safe in the dead space between systems where nothing lived and nothing mattered. She had been wrong. The Dominion of Kethra had found her anyway, their warship appearing out of nowhere like a nightmare made of metal and arrogance. And before she could even reach for her sidearm, they had disabled her vessel and taken her prisoner. Now she stood in a massive courtroom that floated among the stars, a station they called the Throne of Reckoning, surrounded by aliens who looked at her the way a child might look at an insect before crushing it under their foot. The Kethrani were tall and beautiful in a cold and terrible way, their skin like polished silver and their eyes like chips of frozen starlight, and they moved through the chamber with the easy confidence of a species that had ruled 1,000 star systems for 10,000 years. They had never lost a war because no one had ever been foolish enough to fight them, and they had built their empire on the simple belief that they were better than everyone else in the galaxy. Alara watched them from her place among the other prisoners, a collection of broken and frightened creatures from a dozen different worlds, all of them accused of the same crime she had been charged with: trespassing in restricted space. It was a joke of a charge, a convenient excuse to grab anyone they wanted and do whatever they pleased with them, and everyone in the chamber knew it was a lie, but no one dared to say so out loud. The High Arbiter sat on a throne that floated above the crowd, his robes flowing around him like liquid shadow, and when he spoke his voice filled the entire chamber without any effort at all. "You have been found guilty of violating the sacred boundaries of the Dominion," he announced, his tone suggesting he had given this speech 1,000 times before and found it boring each time. "And the punishment for this crime is the Crucible of Atonement." A ripple of fear passed through the prisoners around Alara, and she heard someone begin to sob quietly in the back of the group. She did not know what the Crucible was, but she could guess from the reactions that it was not going to be pleasant. The Arbiter continued without any sign that he noticed or cared about the terror he had caused, explaining in that same flat and bored voice that the Crucible was a trial by survival on a planet called Malachar 7. The rules were simple enough that even primitive species could understand them, he said with a thin smile that made Alara want to break his teeth. "Survive 7 planetary rotations, and you would be declared innocent and set free. Die, and your guilt would be confirmed for all eternity. No one has completed the Crucible in over 400 years, the Arbiter added, and now there was something like amusement in his voice. But we are a merciful people, and we believe in giving the lesser species a chance to prove themselves." He began calling out the prisoners one by one, announcing their species and their supposed crimes to the crowd of Kethrani observers who had come to watch the sentencing like it was some kind of entertainment. And maybe that was exactly what it was, Alara realized as she watched them laugh and point at the terrified prisoners, their beautiful faces twisted with cruel delight. This was not justice. This was a show, a performance designed to remind everyone in the galaxy that the Kethrani were the masters and everyone else was just meat for their amusement. When her name was called, Alara walked forward with her head held high, refusing to shuffle or cower like some of the others had done, and she saw the Arbiter's eyes narrow slightly at her defiance. "Alara Vance," he read from the glowing display before him, "species designation, human, planet of origin, Earth, a quarantined world in the outer spiral arm." The crowd reacted immediately, and the sound they made was not fear or anger or even curiosity. It was laughter. They laughed at her like she was the funniest thing they had ever seen, these ancient and powerful beings who had conquered the stars, and Alara stood perfectly still, while the sound washed over her like poison rain. She had heard humans described by other species before, and she knew what they thought of her kind. Soft, they called them, short-lived and fragile, mammals who had barely learned to walk upright before they started reaching for the stars like children grabbing at things they did not understand. The Kethrani saw humans as jokes, as curiosities, as proof that evolution sometimes made mistakes that should have been corrected long ago. The Arbiter was smiling now, a real smile that reached his cold and distant eyes, and he leaned forward on his floating throne to look at her more closely. "A human," he said, and he did not bother to hide his amusement. "How delightful! I do not believe we have had one of your kind in the Crucible for quite some time." He checked his display again, and his smile grew wider. "The last human contestant survived for approximately 6 hours before being consumed by the wildlife," he told her, and the crowd laughed again at this wonderful joke. "I wonder if you will manage to beat that record." Ilara said nothing. She did not defend herself or beg for mercy or try to explain that she had done nothing wrong, because she knew that none of those things would matter to creatures who had already decided what she was worth. Instead, she looked around the chamber, slowly and carefully, and she memorized every single face that was laughing at her. The Torvani diplomat with the 3 eyes and the cruel mouth. The Silith merchant whose laughter sounded like breaking glass. The Kethrani nobles in their flowing robes who pointed at her and whispered to each other about how quickly she would die. She memorized all of them, burned their faces into her memory like brands, and she made herself a promise that she would remember them for as long as she lived. However long that turned out to be. The Arbiter finished his pronouncements and waved his hand in a gesture of dismissal, already bored with the proceedings now that the entertainment was over, and the guards came forward to lead the prisoners away to the transport ships. As she walked out of the chamber, Ilara passed close to a group of young Kethrani who were still laughing about the human who thought she could survive their trial. One of them called out to her, asking if she had any last words before she went to die on Malachar 7. Ilara stopped and turned to look at him, and something in her eyes made his laughter fade into uncertain silence. "I will see you again," she said, and her voice was calm and quiet and absolutely certain. "Remember that." Then she walked away, and she did not look back. The transport ship dropped her from 50 feet in the air without any warning, and Ilara barely had time to twist her body into a roll before she hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. She lay there for a moment in the red dirt, staring up at a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and she listened to the ship's engines fade away until there was nothing left but silence. Then the sounds of the planet began to fill that silence, and none of them were friendly. Something screamed in the distance, a high and terrible sound that went on far too long before cutting off suddenly in a way that suggested the screamer had found something worse than whatever it had been running from. Something else answered that scream with a roar that shook the ground beneath her back. "Welcome to Malachar 7, she thought, and she forced herself to sit up and take stock of her situation. They had given her a blade that was barely sharp enough to cut bread, a single day's worth of nutrient paste, and a thin jumpsuit that would do nothing to protect her from the elements. The Kethrani really did think of this as entertainment, she realized, because they had given her just enough to make the struggle interesting but not enough to actually survive. The air smelled wrong, thick and chemical and burning in her throat, and when she looked toward the horizon she could see clouds of yellow-green fog rolling between the jagged rock formations that jutted up from the landscape like broken teeth. Acidic fog, her mind supplied from some half-remembered briefing about hostile environments. Avoid breathing it directly and keep it off your skin if you want to keep having skin. She pushed herself to her feet and started moving. Because standing still on a death world was just a slower way of dying, and she needed to find shelter before the sun went down and the real predators came out to play. The other prisoners had been dropped at various points around her, and she could see some of them in the distance, stumbling around in confusion or sitting on the ground with their heads in their hands. A few of them were already dead, their bodies twisted in ways that suggested they had landed badly or had simply given up the moment they hit the ground. Alara did not stop to help any of them. That might sound cruel, but she had learned a long time ago that you cannot save someone who does not want to be saved, and right now, she needed to focus on keeping herself alive long enough to figure out how to keep everyone else alive too. She found a canyon system as the light began to fade, a maze of narrow passages and overhanging rocks that would give her some protection from the fog and the larger predators, and she set about making herself a camp with the kind of calm efficiency that came from years of training and experience. First, she found a defensible position, a small cave with only one entrance and good sight lines in all directions. Then she gathered rocks and arranged them in a pattern that would slow down anything trying to rush her in the darkness. Then she sat down with her back against the wall, and she waited for the night to come. It came fast and it came hungry. The Vethkai found her camp 3 hours after sunset, and it was exactly as terrible as the Kethrani had promised it would be. 6 legs covered in scales that glittered like oil on water, a head full of teeth that seemed to go back forever, and spines running along its back that dripped with something that sizzled when it hit the ground. The creature was the size of a small vehicle, and it moved with a speed that should have been impossible for something that big, flowing over the rocks like liquid death as it circled her position and tested her defenses. Alara watched it from the shadows of her cave, and she felt fear, real and honest fear that made her heart pound and her hands shake, because she was not stupid, and she knew exactly how outmatched she was. But fear was just a feeling, and feelings could be controlled, and she had not survived this long by letting her feelings make her decisions for her. The Vethkai was hunting her, yes, but it was also being careful. It was taking its time, studying her, trying to figure out if she was dangerous or just another easy meal. That meant it was smart, and smart predators could be tricked. Alara pulled out her nutrient paste and squeezed it onto a rock near the entrance of her cave, letting the smell spread out into the night air, and then she retreated deeper into the shadows and found a position beneath an overhang of loose stone that she had noticed earlier. The Vethkai stopped its circling when it smelled the food, its head swinging toward the cave entrance, and for a long moment it just stood there watching and waiting. Then hunger won out over caution, as it always did with predators who had never learned to fear their prey, and the creature lunged toward the entrance with its jaws wide open. Alara moved at the same instant, throwing herself against the support stones she had identified hours ago, and the overhang came down with a roar of breaking rock that buried the Vethkai beneath 1,000 pounds of stone. The creature screamed and thrashed, its legs churning uselessly against the weight that pinned it to the ground, and Alara came out of her hiding spot with her dull blade in her hand. It took her a long time to kill it, longer than she would have liked, but eventually the thrashing stopped and the screaming faded into silence, and she was left standing over the body of something that should have been her death. She did not celebrate or cheer or collapse in relief. Instead, she got to work. The spines came off first, carefully extracted and tested for sharpness, and she found that they held an edge better than anything the Kethrani had given her. The hide came off next, tough and flexible and resistant to the acidic fog that was already starting to drift into the canyon. By the time the sun began to rise, she had weapons and armor, and enough meat to last her for days if she smoked it properly. The other survivors had been watching her from the shadows, she knew, drawn by the sounds of the fight and too afraid to come closer. She could see their eyes glinting in the darkness, dozens of them, all of them wondering what kind of creature had just killed one of Malachar VII's apex predators with nothing but a dull blade and a pile of rocks. Alara looked out at those watching eyes, and she raised her voice so they could all hear her. "I am going to survive this," she called out into the darkness. "And if you want to survive too, then you had better start thinking like hunters instead of prey." Then she turned her back on them and went back to her work, and she did not look up again until the fire was burning and the meat was cooking, and the sun had risen on her second day in hell. She had 5 more days to go. She intended to make them count. By the 3rd day, the word had spread across the killing fields of Malachar 7, passed from survivor to survivor in whispers and frantic hand signals, carried on the wind like a rumor that no one quite believed, but everyone wanted to be true. There was a human in the eastern canyons, they said, and she was not hiding. She was hunting. The first group found her camp just after midday. 4 aliens of different species who had somehow managed to stay alive long enough to hear the stories and desperate enough to seek out the source. The leader was a Torvani, tall and thin with gray skin, and 3 eyes that blinked in sequence when he was nervous, which seemed to be all the time. He had been an engineer on a cargo vessel before the Kethrani took him, accused of carrying contraband that he swore he had never seen before in his life, and he had the hands of someone who built things rather than destroyed them. Behind him came a young Silith, barely old enough to be away from her homeworld, with scales that shifted color based on her emotions, and a talent for moving silently that had kept her alive when larger and stronger creatures had died. She had been a scout for her people before she was taken, learning the ways of tracking and survival, and she looked at Alara with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. The last 2 were brothers from a species whose name came out as a series of clicking sounds that Alara's throat could not reproduce, so she called them simply the twins, even though they did not look anything alike to her human eyes. They were strong and loyal, and they had kept each other alive through 3 days of hell by refusing to leave each other's side no matter what came at them. All 4 of them stopped at the edge of Alara's camp and stared at what she had built. The fortifications were simple but effective, walls of stacked stone that would slow down anything trying to rush the position and give her time to respond. Drying racks held strips of Vethkai meat that would feed a dozen people for a week. Weapons made from bone and spine and sharpened rock were arranged in neat rows, ready to be grabbed at a moment's notice. And in the center of it all sat Alara Vance, calmly sharpening another bone knife like she had all the time in the world. The Torvani was the first to find his voice, and when he spoke his words were thick with disbelief. "You killed a Vethkai," he said, and it was not a question because he could see the proof of it hanging from the drying racks. Alara did not look up from her work. "It was not as hard as they wanted us to think," she replied, testing the edge of the knife against her thumb. "They are fast and they are deadly, but they are also arrogant, and arrogance makes you stupid." The Silith girl stepped forward, her scales flickering through shades of orange and yellow that Alara was starting to recognize as curiosity mixed with caution. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you kill something like that with nothing but a dull blade?" Now Alara did look up, and she met the girl's eyes with a steady gaze that held no anger and no pride, only a calm certainty that seemed to fill the space around her. "I did not kill it with a blade," she said. "I killed it with a trap, and I used its own hunger against it because every predator has the same weakness." She set down the knife and stood up, brushing the dust from her hands. "They all think they are the most dangerous thing in any room they enter, and that makes them careless." The Torvani looked around at the camp, at the weapons and the food and the walls that had turned a dead-end canyon into a fortress, and he asked the question that all of them were thinking. "Why are you not hiding? Why are you building and hunting when everyone else is trying to stay invisible?" Alara walked to the edge of her camp and looked out at the hostile landscape that stretched away toward the horizon, at the acid fog drifting between the rocks and the shapes of predators moving in the distance. "Because hiding is how you die slow," she said, and her voice was hard and certain in a way that made the others stand up straighter. "You can run and you can hide and you can pray that nothing finds you, but eventually something always does." She turned back to face them, and something in her expression made them all take a step back even though she had not moved toward them. "On my world there is a saying that the best defense is a good offense, and my people did not become the dominant species on Earth by cowering in caves and hoping the predators would pass us by." The Torvani's 3 eyes blinked rapidly. "Your world," he said slowly, like he was working through a difficult problem. "The Kethrani said humans come from a quarantined planet. They called it a death world." Ilara smiled, and there was nothing soft in that smile. "They were not wrong," she said. "Everything on Earth tried to kill us, the weather and the animals and the diseases and sometimes even each other, and we survived anyway because we learned to fight back." She looked at each of them in turn, measuring them, deciding something. "The galaxy thinks humans are soft because we are small and we die young, and we do not have claws or scales or venom," she continued. "But they are wrong about what makes a species dangerous." She picked up one of the bone knives and held it out toward them. "This is what makes us dangerous," she said. "The ability to look at something that wants to kill us and figure out how to kill it first. The refusal to accept that we are prey. The absolute stubborn spite that keeps us fighting when any sensible creature would have given up." The Silith girl reached out and took the knife, her scales settling into a deep and steady blue that Ilara thought might mean determination. "You want to teach us," she said. "You want to make us into hunters." "I want to make us into a pack," Ilara corrected her, "because a single hunter can be overwhelmed but a pack can bring down anything." She looked at the brothers who had not spoken since they arrived, standing close together with their shoulders touching like they could not bear to be apart even for a moment. "You two survived by protecting each other," she said to them. "Imagine what you could do with more people to protect." The Torvani engineer stepped forward, and for the first time since Ilara had seen him, his 3 eyes were all focused on the same thing. "Tell us what to do," he said. "Tell us how to fight." Ilara nodded and gestured for them to sit down around the fire she had built. "First you need to understand something," she said as she settled down across from them. "We are not going to just survive this trial. We are going to beat it so badly that the Kethrani will never forget what happened here." She picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt, sketching out maps and plans and strategies. "Now pay attention, because school is in session and the final exam is going to be hell." Over the next 2 days, she taught them everything she knew about staying alive when everything around you wanted you dead. And slowly, one lesson at a time, she turned them from victims into warriors. High above the killing fields of Malachar 7, in a viewing chamber aboard the Throne of Reckoning, the High Arbiter watched the feeds from the surface cameras and felt something he had not experienced in 300 years of life. He felt afraid. The human woman should have been dead by now, torn apart by predators or dissolved by acid fog, or simply broken by the hopelessness of her situation like so many others before her. Instead, she had built a fortress in the eastern canyons and turned a group of terrified survivors into something that moved and hunted like a single organism. The ratings for the broadcast had gone through the roof, viewers across 100 systems tuning in to watch the impossible unfold, and that should have pleased the Arbiter because the Crucible was meant to entertain. But this was not the kind of entertainment the Kethrani wanted. The whole point of the trial was to show the lesser species their place in the natural order, to remind them that the Dominion stood above them all and always would, and watching a human succeed was sending exactly the wrong message. "She has killed 17 apex predators," one of his advisors reported, her voice carefully neutral in a way that told him she was just as disturbed as he was, "and she has unified survivors from 12 different species into a coordinated fighting force." The Arbiter waved his hand in irritation. "I can see the numbers," he snapped. "What I want to know is how we stop this before it becomes a problem." The advisor hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know about what she was going to suggest. "We could adjust the parameters," she said finally. "Send in a team to restore the proper balance of the trial." The arbiter knew what she meant, knew that it violated every sacred law that governed the crucible, knew that if it ever became public knowledge it would be a scandal that could shake the foundations of the Dominion. But he also knew that letting a human complete the trial would be worse. Far worse. "Do it," he said, and he did not let himself think about what that order meant. Send the enforcers. The Kethrani enforcers were the best hunters the Dominion had ever produced, warriors who had been engineered and trained and enhanced until they were perfect killing machines, and they had never failed to eliminate a target in all the centuries since their creation. There were 6 of them in the team that descended to Malachar 7, each one carrying weapons and armor that made the bone knives and Vethkai hide of the survivors look like toys. They landed at the edge of the canyon system, just as the sun began to set on the 6th day, and their leader sent 2 scouts ahead to locate the humans' camp and report back on her defenses. The scouts did not return. An hour passed, then 2, and the leader began to feel the first stirrings of unease in his chest. He had hunted targets across 100 worlds, and he had never lost a scout, never faced prey that could take down one of his soldiers without alerting the others. When he finally led the remaining team into the canyons to investigate, they found the bodies of the scouts staked at the entrance to a narrow passage. Their weapons and armor were gone. Their eyes were open and empty. And carved into the ground at their feet, in perfect Kethrani script that no primitive species should have been able to write, was a message. "You should have let me finish the trial." The leader stared at those words and felt something cold crawl up his spine, something that might have been fear if he had been capable of admitting that he could feel such a thing. Then the ambush began. The first attack came from above, rocks and debris crashing down from the canyon walls to separate the team and force them into defensive positions. The second attack came from the fog, shapes moving through the yellow-green clouds with the kind of speed and precision that spoke of careful planning and ruthless execution. The enforcers were not used to being hunted. They were not used to enemies who knew the terrain better than they did, who had spent days mapping every passage and every dead end, and every place where a trap could be set. They were not used to prey that fought back. One by one, they fell, picked off by enemies they could not see, led into killing grounds where the planet itself became a weapon. One was lured into an acid pool that ate through his armor before he could escape. One was buried under a rockslide triggered by a tripwire he never saw. One was swarmed by a pack of smaller predators that the human had somehow herded into position. The leader found himself alone as the night grew darker, his soldiers dead and his certainty shattered, and he stumbled through the canyons with his weapon in shaking hands. He was the best hunter the Dominion had ever produced, and he was being hunted by something that should have been impossible. He found her waiting for him at the center of the canyon system, standing in the open like she had nothing to fear, her pack arranged around her in a semicircle of bone and scale and fierce determination. The Silith girl was on her right, scales glowing with colors he did not recognize, one of his dead soldiers' weapons held steady in her hands. The Torvani engineer was on her left, wearing armor stripped from another corpse, his 3 eyes fixed on the leader with cold hatred. The twins stood behind them, and the others fanned out to block every escape route. The human woman stepped forward, and the leader raised his weapon to fire. But she was faster, not because she was stronger or more enhanced or better equipped, but because she had been fighting and killing and surviving since before the Kethrani even knew her species existed. She moved like water and struck like lightning, And before the leader could pull the trigger, she was inside his guard, and her bone knife was at his throat. "Your masters sent you to clean up their mess," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the blood on her face, and the bodies of his soldiers scattered around the canyon. They broke their own rules because they could not stand the idea of a human winning their game. The leader tried to speak, but her knife pressed deeper, and the words died in his throat. "Go back to them," she continued. "Go back and tell them that we are coming. Tell them that the trial is over and we won. And tell them that if they ever try something like this again, I will bring this fight to their doorstep." She stepped back and let him go, and for a moment he just stood there staring at her, this small, soft creature who had destroyed the most elite fighting force in the Dominion with nothing but rocks and spite, and an absolute refusal to die. Then he ran, and he did not stop running until he reached the extraction point. Behind him, the human woman watched him go and allowed herself a small, cold smile. One more day, and this trial would be over. And then the real work would begin. The signal that marked the end of the 7th rotation came as a long, low tone that echoed across the canyons of Malachar 7, and when it faded into silence, Alara Vance was still standing. She was not alone. 11 other survivors stood with her, aliens from a dozen different worlds who had learned to fight and hunt and refused to die, and they looked up at the sky as the transport ships descended to collect them. The Kethrani guards who came down the ramps expected to find broken creatures ready to collapse with relief, the way survivors always did when the trial finally ended, and they realized they were going to. Instead, they found warriors. The guards hesitated when they saw the bone weapons and the Vethkai armor, and the cold, steady eyes of people who had spent 7 days becoming something dangerous, and for a moment no one moved. Alara stepped forward and let her knife fall to the ground, not because she was surrendering, but because she wanted them to see that she did not need it to be a threat. "The trial is over," she said, and her voice carried across the landing zone like a blade. "Take us to the Arbiter." They took her. The throne room of the reckoning was packed when she arrived, more crowded than it had been on the day of her sentencing, and she understood immediately that the whole galaxy was watching. The Kethrani had built their empire on spectacle, and they were not about to let this moment pass without an audience, even if that audience was going to see something they had never expected. The High Arbiter sat on his floating throne with his robes arranged around him like liquid shadow, and his face was a mask of cold fury that he was barely managing to control. Alara walked through the crowd of glittering aliens with her pack behind her, and she did not bow or kneel or show any sign of deference to the creatures who had tried to kill her. She stopped at the base of the throne, and she looked up at the being who had sentenced her to death, and she waited for him to speak. "The results of this trial are under review," the Arbiter announced, his voice filling the chamber with carefully controlled rage. "There have been irregularities that call the validity of the outcome into question." A murmur ran through the crowd, some of them confused and some of them angry, and some of them starting to understand what was really happening here. The Arbiter continued, listing the reasons why her survival should not count, why the trial should be declared void, why she should be sent back to Malachar 7 to try again. She had received unauthorized assistance from other prisoners, he said. She had destroyed protected wildlife in numbers that exceeded acceptable limits, he said. She had somehow been responsible for the deaths of a Kethrani security team that had never officially been deployed to the planet, he said. Alara listened to all of it without interrupting, letting him talk himself into a corner while the galaxy watched, and when he finally ran out of excuses, she spoke. "You told me humans cannot survive this trial," she said, and her voice was quiet but it carried to every corner of the chamber. "You told me we are too soft, too weak, too primitive to belong among the stars." She gestured to herself, to the scars that covered her arms and the blood that still stained her borrowed armor, and the bone knife that hung at her belt. Then explain the bodies. The Arbiter's mask of control slipped for just a moment, and behind it she saw something that looked like fear. Explain your enforcers, she continued, taking a step closer to the throne, and the guards around her shifted nervously but did not move to stop her. Explain how a soft and weak and primitive human killed them with rocks and sticks, and nothing but the will to survive. She took another step, and another, and the Arbiter pressed himself back against his throne like he was trying to get away from her without actually moving. Explain why I am standing here, and they are rotting in a canyon on your precious death world. The chamber was silent now, thousands of aliens holding their breath as they watched a human face down the most powerful being in the Dominion. Alara stopped at the edge of the throne's floating platform, and she looked up at the Arbiter with eyes that had seen hell and walked through it anyway. Here is what is going to happen, she said, and her voice was calm and certain and left no room for argument. You are going to validate my trial. You are going to release me and everyone who survived with me, and you are going to update your records about humanity. The Arbiter opened his mouth to protest, but she kept talking, her voice rising to fill the chamber. Because we did not crawl out of our death world by being prey. We crawled out by being the most stubborn and spiteful and creative killers that evolution ever produced. She smiled, and every alien in the chamber saw the predator behind that smile. And now you have our attention. The Arbiter looked at her for a long moment, this small human woman who had done what no one had done in 400 years. And then he looked out at the crowd of viewers who were broadcasting this moment to 100 systems. He could refuse her. He could order her executed right here in front of everyone. But if he did that, every being in the galaxy would know that the Kethrani were afraid of humans, and that fear would spread like fire through dry grass. He made his choice. The trial results are validated, he said, and his voice was hollow. The prisoner and her companions are released with full pardons. Alara nodded and turned to face the crowd, the thousands of faces that had laughed at her when she first stood in this chamber, and she found that none of them were laughing now. Remember this day, she called out to them. Remember what happened on Malachar 7, and remember what a single human did to your enforcers when you tried to cheat. She began walking toward the exit, her pack falling in behind her like they had been following her all their lives. Because the next time you see a human, you will know that we earned our place among the stars the same way we earned everything else. She reached the door and paused, looking back over her shoulder at the Arbiter who still sat frozen on his throne. With our teeth, she finished, and our spite and bodies of everyone who ever underestimated us. Then she was gone, walking out into the galaxy that would never look at humans the same way again. 6 months later, the Dominion quietly abolished the Crucible of Atonement, citing ethical concerns that no one believed. The unofficial records, the ones that only the High Council ever saw, contained a single note that would shape Kethrani policy for generations to come. Do not provoke the humans, do not test the humans, and above all do not give them a reason to remember your name. Commander Alara Vance returned to her salvage work in the Outer Rim, flying the same route she had always flown, and most days she was just another human trying to make a living among the stars. But she kept the bone knife, just in case anyone else needed a reminder of what humans could do when the galaxy tried to tell them they did not belong.